What has the opening 5 weeks of the NFL season done to the Zero RB universe? Does it still exist? How is it going? What is it looking like for the rest of the season? And not just Zero RB, we are looking at the rest of season rankings for all running backs. So I'm looking forward to going into this with Shawn today. Shawn posted the article earlier this week up on RotoViz.com, which you can check out if you haven't done so already. If you're signing up over at rotoviz.com, you can use the promo code RVRadio2023 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount off a RotoViz NFL pass. Shawn, we are 5 weeks through the season. A lot has changed. There will be movement as we look through these rankings. There'll be some of the names that we would be expecting to have at the top of the charts, I guess. So they will be there. It's going to be fun to go through. There'll be some players as well that have missed some time with injury that are right back in the mix heading into NFL Week 6. They'll be featured as well. So I guess as we start off, midpoint of the season, what was some of the challenges looking into ranking the entire basically running backs of the NFL? Over 40 names in this list, Shawn, in terms of, well, it goes all the way down. There's 73 names in total, but they are broken down individually to a certain point, to about 45 names in. What were some of the challenges looking big picture for the rest of the season?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's very easy to rank running backs at this point because you've got 5 weeks worth of scoring. You know what their current ranking is. You know what their current expected point profile is. You know both what the offense is generally doing in terms of creating a certain size of pie, and then you know the slices of that pie that are going out to different players. And you can kind of balance those types of concerns. Certainly, there are going to be a lot of offenses where we would expect them to be more or less normal NFL offenses. And so if they have created extra expected points to the running back position to this point, you're saying, well, that's going to kind of go back to the pack. If there are offenses like the Miami Dolphins, for example, which we know are not normal NFL offenses, you might continue to expect them to create both a little bigger pie, but then also the efficiency, the fantasy points over expectation element is going to be greater. You know, it's not going to be at the level it's been to this point, but you wouldn't expect them to be normal or negative over the second half of the year, obviously. At the same time, you're trying to look at how things might change and who is going to emerge, maybe who's going to fall by the wayside. And you want to do that from a perspective that is evidence-based as opposed to just maybe continuing to fade the same guys, continuing to be excited about the same guys. You don't want it to be a biased look at it. And so then there's that question of, well, how do I take the evidence that we have so far and work that through in a way, again, that's as unbiased as possible? Colm, I've attempted to do that. We're going to throw some of the rankings and tiers out there today. I'm going to give you a shot to tell me where I have messed up. That is always a fun part with it. But one of the things I did here, as you mentioned, for really, I think the top 60 backs, I'll give a key stat for them. And so we have so many of the different tools in play. Got the Advanced Stat Explorer. We've got the Strength of Schedule Streamer. A lot of S's in here, Colm. We got the NFL Pace Tool. We got the RotoViz Screener. We've got the Weekly Stat Explorer. So much cool information that you can find on the site. And then certainly, if you don't want to find it yourself, we've distilled a lot of it for you in the key stats. Colm, tier 1, Christian McCaffrey. He's there by himself. Any complaints about him at the top?
No complaints. He's just going to the moon. We did a bold prediction show, Shawn, before the season. I'll have to go back and listen. And I remember at the time, I didn't have a bold enough prediction with Christian McCaffrey being, the highest touchdown scoring running back. But I think we should have just went and said 30 touchdowns for Christian. So lots more touchdowns coming his way for the rest of the year.
That's what I like to hear. Have some McCaffrey exposure. If you got McCaffrey exposure right now, you are pretty happy with how the 2023 season is going. Colm, the next closest thing to Christian McCaffrey is a rookie, is a running back over there with the Atlanta Falcons, Bijan Robinson, number 2. And I mean, he is averaging 7.8 receiving EP. That's second best at the position. For his rushing peripherals, 22% evasion rate. That's number 5 at the position. We know that the Falcons want to emphasize the run. That's a positive. He has the number 1 ranked remaining schedule. I mean, that's a pretty good quartet of points in your favor. Number 3, Austin Ekeler scores 26 points in week 1. Joshua Kelly has been awful without him, averaging almost a touchdown's worth of fantasy points below expectation per game. Not overall, but per game. The new Chargers offense with their coordinator swap this season has looked good, not great, but has room to grow, especially if you have Austin Ekeler back, Robinson 2, Ekeler 3. Any changes you would make to those guys? And should anyone else join them in tier 2?
I don't think so. I think those guys are closer to Christian McCaffrey, I think, than they are to tier 3. I think they're maybe a 1B. And you mentioned the case there for Bijan. I think all of that with a rookie player looking to ascend. Some people I'm sure will have Austin Ekeler over Bijan, and I think that's also fair. But we're splitting hairs at that point. So both of those guys getting into tier 2 is fair. And I'm very excited to see what Ekeler does in the offense the rest of the way here. Obviously, you mentioned how much his kind of counterparts have struggled in the role without him there. And the other part of that is, no Mike Williams there for the rest of the season. Hopefully Quentin Johnson comes on, but should be as much work as Austin Ekeler can handle. And I know Bijan Robinson is electrifying so far. We've been so impressed with him, but I think Ekeler is the closest to that Christian McCaffrey workload and offensive situation from the two of those guys.
So you're going to go Ekeler first. I like that. Tier 3, Kenneth Walker at 4, Travis Etienne at 5, Jonathan Taylor at 6, BREECE Hall at 7. Those obviously 4 players we invested very heavily in preseason, and for them to be in tier 3, I think you've got to be excited about. Even though Jonathan Taylor and BREECE Hall have not done too much to this point, Jonathan Taylor almost nothing, but ready to light the world on fire now. BREECE Hall, a couple 70-yard runs, but otherwise disappointment in the Jets offense. Colm, the key stat for Kenneth Walker, he ranks number 5 in broken tackles and number 1 in forced missed tackles, despite having already spent a game on the bye. He scored a lot of touchdowns. You'd love to see that. Travis Etienne, he leads the league in broken tackles with 12 and is tied with Walker for the total tackles evaded. So that's broken tackles and forced missed tackles together. He ranks 3rd in yards after contact. And you and I did a show on this earlier in the week talking about how it's really not ideal that the Jaguars are forcing him to create that much of the contact, or I should say that much of the yardage after contact. But 267, he trails McCaffrey and Derrick Henry in yards after contact. When you're looking at a guy who is a speed back, for him to also be doing that, when he's having to deal with so many defenders, I think that part is impressive. I think that we could see an even better season going forward from him. So 4, 5, 6, 7, is that the order? Are those the guys? Should there be anybody else in tier 3 with them?
I would be tempted to put a name that's in tier 4 and with those guys, Shawn, based on, unfortunately, the Achane injury, and that would be Raheem Mostert. I think his position in that offense. I think the BREECE Hall part, again, we're concerned about that offense and how it's going to work moving forward. So there's some concerns, but Mostert, I think, is set up here in a pretty good position. Jeff Wilson is obviously on his way back, but I think both of those are going to get points on a weekly basis. So I might put him towards tier 4. Interesting as well, we mentioned players who have missed time, both Austin Ekeler and Jonathan Taylor. Missing time really set up in good spots as we move forward here the rest of the season. Taylor, obviously, now with a quarterback change with Gardner Minshew in there. I think Travis Etienne, Shawn, if they started to use him similar to how the Dolphins are using their backs, I think there's so much more being left on the table here with Etienne and how he is putting up his points. I think Kenneth Walker's an interesting one, and I agree with you on his ranking, but on the social media side of things, I feel like a lot of people aren't really seeing what Kenneth Walker's doing when he's out there and how he's looking when he's playing. I think sometimes when we've looked at the box score, maybe it isn't as impressive as the plays he is making. And I think people think that Charbonnet is going to really start to cut into that workload. I don't really feel that same way, and I'm excited for him the rest of the season. The order, Shawn, again, splitting hairs is fine, but I would bump Mostert up from tier 4 to tier 3.
Would you move him ahead of any of those 4 backs?
No. Potentially BREECE, but that would break my heart.
Yeah, that would be unfortunate, but I could easily see it happening. The offensive context is going to make a huge
fun
difference.
question, Shawn, for you. Etienne hadn't got injured, obviously Mostert wouldn't be this high, and I wouldn't be making that point forward. But if Etienne had stayed healthy and wasn't missing a minimum of the next 4 weeks, is he as high as tier 2?
I think you still put him in tier 3 because you're going to have to share time with both Mostert and probably Jeff Wilson. You just simply can't do what he has been doing that frequently. And yet, yeah, I mean, you definitely put him there in tier 3 because you've got the perfect offense, you've got the perfect player, the skill level. Now, one of the things that I just really didn't see from him at Texas A&M is the decision-making at the second level to create these big plays. There was a lot of straightforward running. Some of that, you think back to what they were doing and say it just wasn't nearly as good as what the Dolphins do. Now, that's also the case for basically all of the NFL offenses. So you have a little bit of that conflict, but his ability to make guys miss when he's not at full speed. I mean, certainly when you're running that 4-3 and people don't have the angle, that's one thing. But the moves he's made at the second level to get him into that space that has been based on his own agility and lateral quickness, that part I think you can't underestimate either. Again, you're not going to be able to break all of those plays going forward. And so the fact that you're in a timeshare is problematic. And yet, I mean, we haven't seen anything like it maybe since Barry Sanders. And that includes players like a Jamal Charles, like a CJ2K. Now, those guys did it a lot more. And so
now it's not enough that he's the next CJ2K. He's moved on to be the next Barry Sanders. Is that where we're going, Shawn?
Yeah, we're going big. We're going big. We're hoping that he only misses 4 weeks and he comes back and he looks good. I think that you could move Kenneth Walker to the bottom of that tier if you're not as concerned about or excited about the fact that he's already had his bye. That's a little bit of a thing we're looking at here too, because part of this is a template for if you're trying to work through the nuance of redraft trades that are tricky. And, we think through what we're doing with our Dynasty Reanimator series, where we are with our team that loses Justin Jefferson but has Mostert, so you get that value. How do you move these teams into a position to get buys? How do you make them as powerful as you can to win a title? Ben Gretchen and I just did a Stealing Bananas episode on that, if anybody wants to think through like the pure trade aspect of it. But Colm, you and I are looking at it here from the perspective of rankings, tiers, looking at very specific players. We get into tier 4. I've got David Montgomery, the aforementioned Mostert, Tony Pollard, Josh Jacobs, DeAndre Swift, and Saquon Barkley. This is actually a really strong group of players as well. David Montgomery, number 2 in green zone carries, number 1 in green zone touchdowns, tied for that. Despite having missed a game with an injury, you have obviously made the case for Mostert with Tony Pollard. He's only scored on 2 of his 16 carries inside the 10 this year. You would expect that to improve, but his evasion rate has fallen from 22% to 3.7% year over year. I mean, just like the case with Ramondre Stevenson, you don't really think that somehow his talent has evaporated. Some of that is just going to be noise. It's going to be randomness. It's going to be luck. But what Mike McCarthy has done to the offense is certainly discouraging. And right now he's sitting at 11.3 rushing expected points per game. I don't really think that part of it is sustainable for a back with his profile, especially when his direct backup is a solid player, and especially when the offense looks that bad. And so a little bit of a concern there. Josh Jacobs, 5% broken tackles, 2.9 yards per carry. The playmaking is gone, and yet he's jumped to the league lead in running back receptions with 23. And so even though he's played really poorly, he's sitting there at running back 10. So I think that you could actually call him a buy low, maybe my ranking of 11. Again, we got some guys coming back who've been injured, and so they would jump ahead of him. But I think that if you're a Jacobs enthusiast, I mean, you're trying to buy as many shares as you can right now. You love his role in the passing game. DeAndre Swift, folks know about his yards before contact brilliance, but also week 5, almost the EP double-double. You'd like to see him getting involved in the passing game, which happened in that contest. And then Saquon Barkley, the 27-point game column, I mean, it came against the Arizona Cardinals. And so that part is probably in some ways less relevant than just how bad the Giants offense has been overall.
He was fantastic in that, though. I know it was against the Cardinals, but like that looked as close to the old Saquon Barkley as I've seen.
And yet now he's hurt.
Seasons. Yeah.
And so
so
the guys are going to have to come back And
The old,
I mean, these guys with the
old
ankle
injured
injuries,
version.
yeah, I mean, you're not going to be 100%. Do you think he deserves to be in there with the rest of that group? Where do you like DeAndre Swift? How does tier 4 look to you?
Swift is the other player that I would have made a pitch for. I didn't want to give away all of tier 4 before we got there, but I think that he is very close for me to making it into that tier 3. He really is making that backfield his own in terms of being the go-to guy. And I think with the Eagles offense, we're kind of similar in our conversations with them and the Miami Dolphins as to how they're trying to set players up to be in the best position to succeed. I really could see Tony Pollard bouncing back as well. So I think this is really a tier of players who have either really improved as the season is going along in terms of making a case that they are the lead back, and obviously Mostert is more through injury, but as the season has gone on, he has been a superstar in his own right. But David Montgomery has really made the most of his opportunities. He's getting a lot of opportunities, but he's made the most of those. Josh Jacobs hasn't made the most of his opportunities. Pollard hasn't made the most of his. Barkley, obviously through injury, hasn't made the most of his, and Swift has made the most of his opportunities. So I think I would be pushing Swift right up there to kind of the 8 or 9 spot. Probably put him just ahead of David Montgomery, and I would have Mostert in the tier above. So I think I would have him at running back 8. Barkley, Shawn, you made the point that the injuries may be the problem that holds him down. I think based on the 27-point game and how good he looked in that, we were actually going against him in the main event that week, Shawn. One of the reasons I had such a close eye on him in the live action, but watched it then on the replay, and he looked explosive on his touchdown plays, on the other opportunities he had. But yeah, the injuries are back again to haunt him. So agree with the players in there. There's none of the players I'd be dropping down into tier 5 in that list, but Mostert and Swift are pushing on the door. And I have to give a shout out to David Montgomery, but I do think, although Dan Campbell's conversations this week in his press conferences haven't really sounded like they're desperate to give JAHMYR Gibbs a huge amount of work, they feel like David Montgomery is the guy that deserves those 20 carries a game. And then you have the second guy come in, and that's not the way we want to see it as fantasy managers. But the team seems to really, really believe in Montgomery as well. So positive signs for him moving forward here.
So tier 5, we're still in the range that we're getting some sexy names, some guys who could go off for big, big performances. At number 14, I have KYREN Williams. From week 2 to week 5, he's averaged 73% of the team's rushing attempts, 21 ops per game. You start to get to 20 and above, and those guys are getting all the work they can possibly handle. He's tied for the league lead in short yardage rushing touchdowns, but he's averaging below 4 yards per carry behind an offensive line that doesn't grade well. He's only hauled in 13 of his 24 targets. That's obviously not all on him, but shockingly low numbers when you think about the expectation for running back catch rate. Number 15, Aaron Jones. The big question there is health, and yet A.J. Dillon has been so bad that I really think that if this Packers team has aspirations for the playoffs, and I would assume that they do, that Aaron Jones is going to have to be more involved once they get him healthy than he has been in recent seasons. That part for me makes him a fairly exciting player. If you got a full workload, you'd be looking at a lot of fantasy points there. Derrick Henry, 277 yards.
The problem just on Aaron Jones, I know you're going to give me an opportunity to go through these, but he can't seem to get healthy is the problem. And he came back and played, and then a week and a half later, he's out again, whether that was mismanaged by the medical staff, whether he picked up, a strain in the game after the game throughout that week. That feels like that's something that's going to linger season long. I know we talked about Barkley's a second ago, but quite a bit as a Packers fan, quite a bit of concern about Jones getting back to 100%.
So you think the injury risk is not fully appreciated in this ranking?
The part I was going to say when you go through the rest of them is this is the tier where the excitement for players with upside maybe starts to wane a little bit. I probably would have him a little bit lower than this. So yeah.
Derrick Henry, behind a bad offensive line, and shockingly splitting time almost 50-50 with Tyjae Spears, still number 2 in yards after contact. That's total yards after contact. He's playing well, but the situation is probably very poor from a fantasy perspective. So he falls to RB16 from where he was preseason. 17, Alvin Kamara has come back. Colm, I believe that in 2 weeks, he's got 16 catches for 50 receiving yards. The 16 catches are good.
Great in PPR leagues.
The other part of that emphasizes where Alvin Kamara is now. It emphasizes where that New Orleans Saints offense is now. Maybe some disconcerting things there. Number 18, James Cook. And then I have another tier break. James Cook, a guy who I think we're still going to get some big games from. If you didn't check out Blair Andrews' wrong read last week and you had a close start-sit call, went the wrong way, he's got some great information on how those games are going to play out and warn you maybe to get off of Cook there. Anybody in that tier that you'd move down completely to the next level?
I think I would probably move Jones down, and I do have concerns with Henry as the season goes on. That I don't think it's a case that we're going to get Tyjae Spears taking his role, but I think that it's already pretty even in terms of how they're using him, and I think that at this point is not a good sign for Henry for the long term, and also the offensive side of things. I'm interested with the Kamara, obviously getting a huge amount of targets, but not very valuable targets at that, as you mentioned, 16 catches for 50 total yards. So that will come, but I'm interested to see what Kendry Miller can do to work into Kamara's workload over the next kind of 4 weeks or so.
And so Kamara went 312 in our resurrection draft. That gives you a little bit of a feel. He was the only player from this tier who was drafted in the third round. Now, granted, it was the last pick in the third round. A lot of their guys drafted early to mid 4. But I think that if you stashed Kamara and you have a variety of things that you can do, you need to maybe move that value in a different position. He's a guy who you can probably move for more than at least Colm and I think he is actually worth. Getting into tier 6, number 19, JAHMYR GIBBS has some great peripherals, but a lot of those were actually generated in the very first week. Hasn't been as impressive since then. He does still look like a guy who could score through the air. And one of the things here, only has a 58-52 edge in routes over Montgomery, but a 19-9 target edge. He also has air yards. They've used him down the field. A lot of the running backs really don't generate any of those as we go through the season because they're being targeted exclusively behind the line of scrimmage. It's not necessarily good or bad, but it does add a little bit of flexibility. If he can make some of those plays, it gives him a role. The biggest thing here is you're looking at him as another one of these guys with an Aaron Jones where injuries could really limit his ability to stay there, much less move up. Number 20, ISIAH PACHECO, 52% snaps, 26% team opportunity share. Those are red flags.
High knees on his runs.
He's got high knees. Yeah, I mean, you want to be flexible. You want to get yourself ready there. Number 21, Jerome Ford. Over the last 2 weeks, only 5.2 rush expected points. He's getting hit at or behind the line of scrimmage. Only the Texans, Titans, and Steelers are generating fewer run block points earned per play. So thinking about EPA, breaking it down, assigning points to individual units. That's one of the stats that you can get with us there in the advanced team stat explorer. The offense a real concern for Jerome Ford. People love the opportunity. I like the opportunity. I wish I had him on all teams. Certainly not saying that we don't like Ford, but he's probably a guy who is at least a little bit overvalued when you think through the context. The next guy on the list, number 22, Jaleel McLaughlin. Colm.
Controversy here, Shawn.
Controversy, I guess, as someone who has a decent amount of Javonte Williams and still expects Javonte Williams to have a good season, I do think there's a real threat there. You've got speed, and this is a team that needs electricity. Number 23, Brian Robinson. Talked in the key stat about how he's been game scripted out of 2 games already in 5. That is an issue for him there. Washington has played the 4th most offensive snaps when trailing by a touchdown or more, and they have the highest pass rate among teams in that game environment. Unfortunately, those are going to be Antonio Gibson snaps. We want Sam Howell to lead some extremely effective early game drives and for that Washington defense to play a little bit better. Dameon Pierce doesn't have an RB1 performance through 5 weeks. The Texans have the 2nd highest percentage of blown blocks in the running game. It's crushed his fantasy points over expectation. Number 25, Jaylen Warren. The Steelers have actually 229 points while tied or trailing.
Not
Warren, Warren 2.3 yards per route. Najee Harris 0.6. These two guys have actually run routes at a fairly similar rate, but I mean, Warren is just much, much, much better, right? He ranks number 1 in both broken tackles and forced missed tackles as a receiver among all running backs. We saw that in week 5, where some of the biggest plays in the entire game, the plays that allowed the Steelers to stay close, were, I mean, these weren't just highlight runs. These were hero runs from Jaylen Warren when he caught the ball out of the backfield. Look for him to be more involved. Look for Najee Harris to continue to slide. Jeff Wilson, 26. Last season, after he came over in week 9, he and Raheem Mostert used almost exactly the same. He had an edge of 259 to 253 in total snaps. He's going to be less expensive. That's the reason that we added him. Colm, 3 of the last 5 players right there we drafted in our resurrection draft. So these are some guys in this tier 6 where I do feel fairly comfortable making at least mild flag plant projections for them rest of season. Number 27, Tyjae Spears. Check out the stats here when you get a chance. Go to the article. He maybe has the best rushing profile of any back in the entire NFL whose name is not DeVon Achane. Number 28, Javonte Williams. Number 9, Ramondre Stevenson. Have some interesting stats there. We're desperately hoping that like all of his talent hasn't somehow vanished.
Desperately, Shawn. We are desperately hoping.
30, Achane. People know the situation there. 31, Alexander Madison. The reverse FPOE leaderboard column through 5 weeks.
This is Miles the one you don't want to be on, Shawn.
This is the one you don't want to be on. Miles Sanders, minus 22. Joe Mixon, minus 21. Dameon Pierce, minus 18. Madison, minus 18. Josh Jacobs, minus 17 and a half. A.J. Dillon, your guy there with the Packers. Again, one of the reasons why I think that Aaron Jones, if he can stay healthy, might have a big role. Minus 16. And then Ramondre Stevenson, minus 13. Those are the guys who are really hurting their teams by underperforming. And then number 32 overall, getting back to the rankings, is Joe Mixon. So in this tier here, we have a bunch of players from the reverse leaderboard. But Colm, we know that it's not all about efficiency. Number 1, volume is going to rule the day in many cases. And number 2, that efficiency could bounce back. So as you're looking at this tier that's a bigger tier here, a little flatter tier, where am I too high? Where am I too low?
This is a tier where it has players that you can be enthusiastic and excited about if the opportunity grows. And then it has veterans who have an opportunity who is very hard to get excited about. So like I talked about the situation with the Lions, I think GIBBS is in a fair spot there, but it's going to be a case that he's going to have to be very efficient with the chances he gets to hit anything like we had hoped he would have when we were drafting in the preseason. The one, Shawn, I think I mentioned the word controversy is Jaleel McLaughlin has looked great. I still think that I would have Javonte Williams, and we are recording this before Thursday Night Football for people who will be listening to it after, or depending on what happens there. I think I'd still give that edge to Javonte. I think the team will give him the chance to be the starter. How we talk in situations how the younger player, the rookie, could come in and take that work. I think that's where we are now. If Javonte doesn't, do some big things in the next 2 to 3 weeks, coming back off that injury. The player, Shawn, I think that could be pushed up a little bit higher here is Jaylen Warren. He's at 25. I think we could push him up to 19, 20 in this kind of range. I think that we talked about it in the preseason that he's coming for that starting job, and the Steelers have not really been good on offense, but they are much better when he is there versus when they have Najee Harris in that spot. The other one as well that I could probably do that, I mentioned Derrick Henry in the previous tier. Tyjae Spears at 27 could probably push up a little bit. If you're looking for players that I potentially would swap them with, would be the likes of Dameon Pierce and Jerome Ford. I think that Ford will have some tough days moving forward the rest of the season here, with partly because of the offense and how much the Browns are going to struggle. how that quarterback situation is evolving and just how good Chubb is when he is healthy and when he's in there. I think it's, people thought that might just be a case that he goes in there and replaces that, and obviously that's not possible with how good Nick Chubb is. So all pretty fair, but it is kind of a list when I'm sure the listeners hear us going through that. They know exactly the players that we're probably not looking to have on rosters, but I think they are fairly ranked overall. But I want to give a shout out to Warren to push him up a little bit higher. I also think, Shawn, that we'll change it up a bit for the last portion of the show here. Instead of giving away all 65 stats, tier 7, tier 8, is there any guys in here that from the start of the season to now, I guess more on the ascendant side, there's some players in this like Najee Harris in tier 7 who is sliding down, Miles Sanders sliding down, but is there any players here that have the potential to make a drastic step forward here before the end of the season? I guess players that if people are looking for a third or fourth running back on their roster for that little bit of depth that maybe people should target with what you've seen over the first 5 weeks.
Yeah, so first of all, to start there with tier 7, we're going to have a lot of the guys who are really in pretty similar situations where the contingent plays like Zach Charbonnet, you'd mentioned that people were still confident in his ascension. I think that makes sense, and you should probably be drafting him around the same spot. I also think that we were correct in Harris more or less losing his starting job, and then with guys like Rachaad White and Miles Sanders, the workload has been there, but the performance hasn't locked that in to where that part of it still looks mostly right, and that they have to actually go out there and do something now to just maintain the scoring level that already isn't difference making for you. So it's kind of that small win, big loss type of player. Of course, if they do make that step over the second half of the season, it becomes a much bigger win. You move down to tier 8, similar types of elements there. Obviously, James Conner, I think, was doing a better job than White and Sanders, but he gets hurt. That takes him and, almost pulls him out of the equation when you consider just how limited the run game value was in Arizona. I think because he's played so well, it gives us the impression that the Cardinals were creating more value in the running game than they actually were. They're still at the bottom of the league in that. I guess I don't know that I have guys who are great breakout options other than saying I think you want to be careful about completely selling Kendre Miller, because as that team evolves over the final 2/3 of the year, they're going to really want to give him a shot at the expense of their veteran back if he becomes clearly the future. There's probably a little bit of upside in Chuba, even though that offense doesn't look particularly good. I think Jordan Mason is interesting. Out of San Francisco, you're getting some rhetoric about how he needs to be the backup, that sticking with Elijah Mitchell, who can't stay healthy, is just hurting the team's preparation. I think Mason is a guy you want to add to the end of teams there. Keaton Mitchell, somebody we mention from time to time. I still like him, and I'm still, I mean, if your roster is deep enough, I'm still stashing Zach Evans and Sean Tucker. Those are situations, again, where the starter is not somebody who's going to hold off a back who makes a move. Now, those guys may never make a move, right? Sean Tucker has been swarmed under in the backfield on any attempts he's gotten this season and has appeared to at least temporarily lose the backup job. But again, when you're talking about the backup jobs, when you're talking about the upside as a season progresses, you do want to be focusing on the talent. So when you have guys who put up big total production numbers in college and are more athletic, don't let early season rookie foibles completely move you off of them. Now, I'm not saying it's a lock by any stretch, and it's only a situation where you would stash them if you have spots. They're going to be on your watch list more than on your roster right now. Don't forget about some of those players. Don't forget about Pierre Strong. Again, in really deep leagues there. I don't know that there are any great answers about clear-cut guys once we get into the range you're talking about, but we're going to get some surprises. That's one of the things that you do know. When you think about 2021 and where guys like Sony Michel, Devin Singletary, Rashad Penny, the true tournament winners from that year, in week 5, going into week 6, you'd be laughing at the idea that that was how it was going to turn out. That's why this is so much fun. We're going to get some twists and turns. The roller coaster of fantasy football at the running back position is going to continue to take us through some spins and twirls as we go through the rest of this campaign.
You stole my joke, Shawn. I was going to say 61 is Devin Singletary and 72 is Rashad Penny, and the season hasn't even started for those guys yet.
Hasn't even started.
We'll see what happens, but there's going to be twists, there's going to be turns, and there's going to be surprises. As Shawn mentioned, there's going to be names down here based on injuries, based on performance, that will still have a role to play. So as I mentioned, there is 62 key stats in this. It goes all the way down to 73 players. I will link it in today's show notes. Head on over and check it out. We will be back on Monday, hopefully, with a RotoViz Overtime Week 6 recap show. Shawn is heading traveling for a little bit of time. We're going to try and keep the shows going with pre-recorded shows. The recap show this week will be obviously not pre-recorded because although we like to think, Shawn, we can tell the future, we are not that good that we can know exactly what is going to happen ahead of time. But we may have some guests on as well. We have a lot of stuff to keep you entertained, we hope, as we move through these next couple of weeks. But that is going to do it for today's edition of RotoViz Overtime. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at OverTimeIreland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work, including today's piece, up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.